Hey, Dr. Challa. This is my book review on the book Messelson, Stahl, and the Replication of DNA. It's a book by Frederick Holmes. And the way that this book was set up was kind of interesting since it doesn't just go into like the narrative history of Messelson and Stahl and how they met and how they came to work together and find the method of replication of DNA, but instead it's more focused on um, getting it seems like the author read through a lot of papers and um, interviewed Messelson and Stahl over the course of a long time and gathered a lot of very detailed, very intricate information. And so the book felt like it was a periodical kind of detailing every step of the way that could have led Messelson and Stahl to come up with the experiment um, that led to their fame in the scientific world. So, while that was interesting to see, and it was at some points, it kind of felt more like a textbook since it was very dense and very, very, very detailed. And for someone who has a little bit more limited scientific knowledge, I think that it was somewhat of a difficult read at some points, um, especially when it was talking about a lot of the background experiments that kind of led Messelson and Stahl to come up with the ideas that they came up with to start this experiment. But as a whole, I think that it was a very interesting read because you get to see kind of like into the minds of a scientist and all of the struggles and turmoil that goes along with that. Um, so it begins with talking about the scientific community and where everybody was standing at in the 1950s. Watson and Crick had just released their paper describing the structure of DNA, and the book talks a lot about how the scientific community, when I remember this one specific point in the book, it said that Watson was giving a presentation on his findings, and for once, usually if something is brought up to a group of scientists, like a new discovery, there'll be lots of questions, lots of discourse. But it seems like when Watson gave the presentation, it was completely silent and maybe a few questions for clarification, but the structure of DNA just made so much sense. And I think that that was, it kind of like it just made sense because it was kind of simplified and not as complex and convoluted as most people would have thought. But even still, there was still the question of how DNA was replicated, because what Watson and Crick were proposing was that the double helix structure, it was strong enough to hold all of the DNA, and the base pairing structurally should have worked. But when the replication problem comes up, there's the issue of how the DNA is going to unwind, because if it's such a sturdy set structure, then it wouldn't make sense for replication to happen in a way that completely takes apart the DNA strand and unwinds it. So structurally, a lot of chemists were unsure about the validity of their findings. So we fast forward to when it talks about when Messelson met Stahl. It was really funny. They met at Woods Hole in the summer of 1954, and they were both grad students. Messelson was at Caltech studying under Linus Pauling, and he was doing a lot of chemistry work, especially with X-ray crystallography. So the findings from the replication, or not replication, the DNA structure were particularly interesting to him. And what happened was that they were, I don't know, I just thought that it was really interesting because they kind of started at humble beginnings, and they worked together and found something that was so novel and so extremely important. And their beginnings were Stahl was trying to solve a math problem, and he was just drinking by the tree in the summer. And then Messelson came up after, I think it was Watson or Pauling, saw Stahl and was like, oh yeah, that's Stahl. And so Messelson went and helped Stahl solve that problem. So they were pretty impressed with each other. I think There was one quote from the book where Stahl called Messelson one of the smartest people he knew, and it was just pretty interesting. So with the actual experiment themselves, there was a famous scientist named Dorman was kind of the mentor for Messelson and Stahl. They eventually got together in the problem after a lot of discourse and just trying to like organize who's going to go where, since they both Stahl and Messelson were at different universities. But eventually, after they moved together in the same house, they found it easier to start working on the same problems together. And it was a little bit difficult because Messelson was still in grad school, so he had his thesis to worry about, which had nothing to do with the like bacterial systems that they ended up working with. They came up with the idea to replicate DNA using deuterium-laden phage particles. They thought that they could use centrifuge technology, since Caltech was one of the most advanced places at the time. So they had this really intense, crazy centrifuge that they ended up using, and they found that when they used phage DNA, it didn't really work. They're hoping to see the different like banding patterns in a test tube. They were hoping that would allow them to see exactly how the DNA was transferred over generations, and they found that it didn't work. So eventually they ended up using bacteria. So over the course of several trial and error periods, they found that the phage DNA that they wanted to use with deuterium wasn't really working. They had a lot of problems. The phage wasn't replicating in the ways that they would hope it would. And there were just a lot of issues. So eventually they decided to use heavy nitrogen isotopes so that they could look and see how the banding patterns would work in bacteria. And then in October of 1957, they found that it worked, and they were able to create the first generation to show the right banding patterns. Max Delbruck was one of Messelson's and Stahl's biggest motivating force. He was their mentor essentially throughout the process, and after the experiment itself, the results were so conclusive and everything had such a finality to it that the results were great and the scientific community would have eaten it all up. But Messelson and Stahl were kind of not really working their hardest to write this paper. They're kind of procrastinating. So it was a really funny point in the book where it talked about how Max Delbruck forced Messelson and Stahl to go to a marine station, and he locked them in a room for several days and hoped that they would write their paper, which didn't happen, but it was just kind of interesting. So the author decided to go a lot in depth into the rationale behind why certain aspects were included in experiments and why things were done a certain kind of way. And I think that, for me personally, I feel like the fact that he went into so much detail kind of made this a harder read, since I would read, it would seem like the author was going to start talking about, the experiment and exactly, what was happening with the big experiment, and that anticipation was kind of crushed when I found that they would do an experiment and he would tell us the results, the methodology, and then find that it didn't work. And you wouldn't know about that until after you read the whole the sentence. And while it was kind of frustrating for me at the time when I was reading the book, I think that after thinking about it, it kind of made me realize that that's kind of what science is like. And the experience of me being in the class for 201 kind of helped me really see that even if the rationale is there, everything was done correctly. There were no mistakes that could have happened. Sometimes the experiments just don't work, And so the only thing you can do is try to reevaluate everything that could have gone wrong and just go back and do it again. I mean, there's not really another option a lot of times. And it seemed like there were times when Michelson and Stahl were frustrated with their lack of results, especially towards the beginning when their experiment wasn't really working with the phage particles. But they used a lot of their scientific knowledge and also their intuition to come up with the best solution. And eventually it worked out for them. And so I think that that was really like a really valuable thing to pick up from the book. So I'm gonna go open the questions that we were told to write about. Some of the most interesting parts of the books were the parts that didn't necessarily talk about the methodology of the experiments, but the personal aspect. It was very interesting to see how the personalities of the scientists came into play. I kind of talked about this in class when I was giving my report, but there's a lot of scientists, their personality kind of comes through in an experiment. And I think that it kind of sounded convoluted or strange when I was talking about it, but when you think about it, scientists are only going to do what is within their power and what they personally feel like is the best route to go. And their personal beliefs do come in a lot and kind of leads them into the right direction in an experiment. So towards the beginning of the novel, it was talking about how Delbruck, he's kind of a perfectionist and loves like simplicity, and he believes that if something is more simple, and then that kind of should makes more sense. He like had a real big appreciation for beautiful things, is how that's how the author put it. So in his work, you could tell like his findings were very meticulous, and the way that he came across to Michelson and Stahl was to just push them towards perfection. And I think without that, Michelson and Stahl might not have gone as far in their work. And that's another thing that I thought that was very interesting, the importance of mentorship. And I got a lot of that in 201 when I, like, throughout the class. I think without the help of the TAs and Sammy and you, really I would not have come close to understanding anything about like the CRISPR-Cas9 system. And looking back now, I realized like towards the beginning of the year, I had kind of had a vague understanding of what was involved in the experiments, but towards the end of the course, I was looking back and I was surprised because I knew so much. And I didn't realize that I had learned all this stuff, and it just became almost like second nature to me. So it was just really interesting to see how that kind of pans out in a broader aspect over the course of many, many years, like Michelson and Stahl and all the scientific community of the time. Also, going along with the personality aspect, I thought it was funny to see how Caltech, they kind of talked about the social struggles. So Caltech was very male-dominated, and so Michelson would complain that there was a lack of females, and he would always try to go out to the bars and like hit on whoever he could, but he was feeling depressed at Caltech because there weren't enough of a female presence. And Stahl had big relationship troubles when he met his wife pretty young and married her pretty quickly, and then they were having a lot of relationship struggles based because she didn't want to live in Caltech. Pasadena, California was where Caltech was, and so they had a lot of strife in their relationship. And reading all of that kind of made me realize is that there's such a human aspect to science that people tend to forget about. Because when you're reading in a textbook, you're reading about all this data and all the evidence that has been thrown out at you, but you don't realize that there were people behind this, and people have, you know, human emotions, and sometimes that can get in the way of progress, sometimes it can help. So it was just kind of an interesting thing to think about. And it was really, I related a lot to how, especially towards the early years when they were talking about how Messelson went to go talk to, like, when Messelson was first at Caltech, he wanted to go work with Max Delbruck, but when he went and talked to him about like the experiment with, I think at that point he hadn't even known about the Watson and Crick experiment, or not experiment, but the findings. And then Delbruck was just like, you don't know enough. Come back when you know more about the subject. And so, I mean, like, obviously Messelson was a very intelligent man and was very capable of learning this material, but he took a step back and realized that there was so much he didn't know about, and he had to go back and learn about all this stuff before jumping to any like sort of conclusions or moving forward with anything in his field. So I found that like kind of interesting, because right now I'm at a point where I'm kind of new to science and exploration in that sort of sense. So it kind of made me realize that there's a starting point for everyone, and it's important to not give up so quickly. Because, I mean, I think that a lot of young scientists growing up in our education system, we're kind of led to believe that if you don't find an answer immediately, then there's like inherent fault within us and we're doing something wrong and maybe we're not cut out for science. But I think it's really important to understand that the fact that we make so many mistakes and learn from them is what makes science so profound and great. Because without making the mistakes that we do, then we have nothing, essentially. If we got everything right all the time, then there would be so many unknowns. And I think that it's good, even though it's really frustrating to have do something a certain way and be completely wrong, there's still something you can gather from your mistakes. And you never know, maybe the data that you find that's not important at one point will become exponentially important to someone else at another point. So I think that for anybody that's kind of more versed in scientific concepts and who would like to know about kind of the whole process of science, I think that this book is a really great read. Especially since it goes a lot into overall it was a pretty great read, and I would suggest it for anybody who's Alright, so that's my review of the book. I liked it for the most part, except for the parts that were a little bit too dense for me. I think it was a very good and insightful kind of book for anybody to read. So I'll see you later.